When we think about medieval Scandinavia, we picture wooden longhouses, open fires and harsh winters endured through thick fur and iron resilience. But deep in the northern villages, a parallel architectural tradition existed, one that ignored wood almost entirely and instead used earth, grass, turf and stone as the core building material. These were the underground turf houses, partially buried into the landscape, engineered to withstand temperatures that could reach 30 degrees to 34 degrees, hurricane-grade winds, and months of snow cover. What makes these structures remarkable is not their age, but their thermal efficiency. They stored heat like natural batteries, resisted freezing through insulation systems that worked even when wet, and used ground stability to reduce structural stress. These were not primitive shelters. They were climate-engineered habitats built from physics, necessity, and environmental intelligence. Modern insulation mimics some of these principles, but Scandinavians applied them nearly 1,000 years earlier, using only natural resources. In this video, we will dissect how these homes were constructed, why they were built underground instead of above, how moisture was controlled despite constant exposure to snow, how heat was produced and distributed inside sealed earth structures, and why turf performed better than timber in sub-zero climates. We will also examine architectural evolution, material behavior, thermal science, and survival logic behind these homes. This script will explain airflow channels, wall compression layering, seasonal building cycles, Viking-era foundation engineering, fungal resistance in turf materials, heat reflection geometry, and how underground architecture reduced fuel consumption during long winters. If medieval Scandinavian builders had access to modern terminology, we would classify these structures as geothermal insulation systems, passive thermal storage architecture, biofiber weatherproof insulation, and load-balanced earth compression foundations. But they achieved it all without terminology, only practice. Now let's break down the 5 major components of their system. 1. Geothermal positioning and earth load foundations. Scandinavian turf houses were positioned using a method that prioritized geothermal stability, soil compression physics, and frost-resistant load distribution. The homes were not simply dug into the ground, they were anchored into thermal zones, where soil temperature remained higher and more stable than surface air. Even in the coldest months, deep earth rarely drops below freezing. Builders used this advantage deliberately. The house pit was excavated only 120 centimeters deep, not too shallow to freeze, not too deep to destabilize. Foundation trenches were then lined with flat stone slabs, not for decoration, but because stone acted as a humidity-inert thermal mass, preventing soil moisture from migrating upward into the load beams. Load-bearing poles were placed on top of stone supports, rather than being driven directly into soil. These poles were not traditional timber beams, they were compression load pillars, built from thicker, slower-drying wood like pine or birch, chosen because these species remained structurally stable even when humidity fluctuated. The poles were positioned in a pentagonal or rectangular geometry depending on region, but always with a key rule: weight pushed downward, not outward. Underground homes are vulnerable to lateral soil pressure, especially when frozen soil expands. To counter this, medieval Scandinavian builders used earth load balancing, meaning the roof and wall weight were designed to compress the soil downward, offsetting frost expansion sideways. This is the opposite of modern foundations that resist pressure. Scandinavian foundations used pressure as stabilization. Builders also added gravel microbeds between stone supports to encourage water drainage without trapping humidity. In winter, frozen water in soil expands, creating movement. But a drained gravel bed reduced trapped water volume, reducing frost lift by up to 40–60%. These builders also avoided valleys where water collected, instead choosing slopes where water naturally drained away from the home footprint. The house entrance was placed downhill because doorways were humidity leakage points. Placing them downhill prevented snowmelt from flowing inward. Farmers also built secondary frost skirts, layers of compact turf and stone extending 30–80 centimeters beyond the home's outer walls. These skirts behaved like frost shock absorbers, taking soil expansion stress before it reached the core foundation. Over time, villages introduced seasonal foundation resets, replacing outer turf foundation layers every 2 to 3 winters, preventing microbial softening from weakening the load system. The entire foundation design treated the earth not as something to resist, but something to load, compress, drain, and thermally couple. These homes survived not because they blocked winter, but because they merged with the ground to escape it. 2. Turf wall engineering. Layered, breathable, and frost-resistant insulation. Medieval Scandinavian builders treated turf as an engineered composite material rather than simple cut grass blocks. The core challenge they solved was counterintuitive. Wood rots when wet, stone sweats when sealed, but turf must survive while constantly interacting with moisture. Their solution was a wall system that managed humidity instead of trapping it. Turf. Blocks were harvested with their root structure intact because the dense interlocking roots acted as a natural water-resistant outer skin. The blocks were cut in rectangular slabs, roughly 30–40 centimeters long, 20–25 centimeters high, and 6 to 12 centimeters thick depending on region. But the real intelligence was not in the turf itself, it was in how it was layered. Each block was rotated 90 degrees in alternating rows, similar to a cross-laminated structure. This prevented rain or melting snow from creating continuous vertical moisture tracks through the wall. If water cannot trace a straight path inward, it evaporates outward faster than it infiltrates inward. Builders intuitively discovered a principle modern material science later formalized. Discontinuous moisture paths increase drying speed and reduce internal absorption. These walls were not sealed with clay or mortar. Instead, seams were left intentionally imperfect, allowing vapor to escape, creating a system closer to a natural drying membrane than a barrier. The second layer of the wall system was designed for thermal storage, not structural load. Beneath the outer dense root turf layer, builders used drier, pre-seasoned turf harvested earlier in the year and stored under roofs. This inner turf contained less sap moisture and behaved like a fibrous heat sponge. Between layers, thin wooden laths or branch grids were inserted not to hold the turf up, but to maintain micro-air pockets. These pockets allowed slow internal evaporation while preventing convective heat loss. A fully sealed air gap creates condensation, but a semi-open microgap ventilates without chilling, balancing moisture diffusion with warmth retention. In areas where wind exposure was extreme, inner air pockets were made smaller, while in damp, coastal regions, gaps were slightly larger to accelerate humidity cycling. The wall therefore adapted to geography, behaving like a dynamic climate response system. The weight of the roof pressed downward onto the walls, compressing the turf layers just enough to stabilize them, but never enough to seal the air pockets entirely. Compression-controlled structure, airflow-controlled dryness, and fiber density-controlled insulation. Another underestimated advantage was turf's thermal inertia in freezing conditions. When surface moisture on outer turf froze, the ice did not damage the material, it actually created a temporary vapor lock that forced deeper moisture to migrate outward toward the ice layer. Then, when temperatures fluctuated during the day and ice sublimated into vapor, wind passing through the outer turf layer carried that moisture away instantly. Instead of failing under freeze-thaw cycles, turf used freeze-thaw cycles as part of its drying engine. This is why medieval Scandinavians scheduled turf cutting and wall repairs just before major frost periods, cold nights, improved long-term dryness rebound. Additionally, turf naturally resisted mold better than wood because its fibers redistributed humidity without remaining constantly saturated in one zone. Mold needs stable, wet conditions to colonize, but a wall that constantly absorbs and releases moisture through airflow cycling never gives spores enough time to root. Some villages even dusted outer turf layers with wood ash slurry, which increased alkalinity and further discouraged fungal colonization, functioning like a primitive but effective antimicrobial treatment. The wall system also worked as a sound dampener and windbreaker, improving indoor retention rates. Houses built purely from timber whistled under Arctic winds, creating psychological stress and faster perceived heat loss. Turf walls eliminated this problem. Wind hit the structure, but did not penetrate it directly. Instead, it moved around it, reducing heat escape velocity. Builders also slightly curved outer walls inward in some regions, not for aesthetics, but to encourage wind acceleration along the surface, which increased evaporation pull without increasing internal pressure. This made the homes warmer and drier over long periods. So the real secret was not one single method, it was a combined system. Discontinuous layering, micro-air pocket engineering, freeze-thaw humidity migration, alkaline anti-fungal defense, roof compression balance, and wind surface velocity design. The result was a wall that stayed insulated through winter, dried continuously even when wet, resisted fungi without chemicals, and maintained warmth long after fires cooled. This was far from primitive sheltering. It was moisture-immune insulation engineering born from environmental necessity. Seasonal harvest logic. Cutting, curing, and timing firewood for maximum dry longevity. Medieval Scandinavian farmers never treated firewood harvesting as a year-round activity. It was a seasonally gated operation, synchronized with the biological moisture cycle of trees, soil frost behavior, and atmospheric humidity shifts. The goal was not simply to collect wood, but to collect it at a time when it already contained the least internal water. In northern climates, trees store large amounts of sap and free water in spring and summer to support growth. Cutting wood during that period guaranteed months of drying time before it could burn efficiently, and even then, core moisture often remained locked behind bark and dense fiber. Scandinavian farmers therefore established a harvesting window that began in late autumn, peaked during the first hard frost weeks of winter, and ended before spring thaw. Wood cut when temperatures were already below freezing contained 30–50% less mobile sap moisture than wood harvested in warmer months. This meant logs entered storage already partially cured. Farmers also observed that timber cut during frost periods did not bleed liquid sap onto storage platforms, preventing secondary moisture contamination inside the stack. The cold essentially worked as a pre-extraction dehydration phase before drying even began. However, timing alone was not enough. Farmers paired the harvest window with a delayed splitting protocol. Fresh logs were left round and bark sealed for 7 to 21 days after cutting, depending on precipitation risk. Bark acted as a short-term moisture armor, preventing rain absorption while internal vapor pressure stabilized. If logs were split immediately after cutting, the exposed inner fibers absorbed atmospheric moisture faster than they released, reversing the drying gradient. The delay ensured that when splitting finally occurred, the log no longer pulled water inward aggressively. Farmers then split logs into halves or quarters using iron wedges and mallets, increasing internal surface area for evaporation. But unlike modern wood processors that split uniformly, Scandinavian farmers split wood based on density, fiber direction, and seasonal burn order, not symmetry. Dense hardwoods like ash and oak were split into larger segments because their internal fibers dried slower but retained dryness longer once cured. Faster drying woods like birch or alder were split smaller because they dried rapidly and could be burned earlier, functioning as dryness stabilizers inside mixed stacks. This created a reverse hygroscopic drying cascade, where fast-drying logs helped pull moisture from slower-drying logs during the long storage season. Farmers also engineered a species-segregated stacking hierarchy. Wood was not stored by household ownership, but by winter usage probability curves. Villages built separate stacks for softwood and hardwood. Softwood stacks were positioned in maximum wind corridors because they absorbed moisture faster and needed constant drying. Hardwood stacks were positioned slightly more sheltered because once cured, hardwood maintained dryness even in moderate humidity. Farmers also never fully debarked wood, except when immediate burn was required. Instead, they practiced directional debarking, peeling bark only from the top or south-facing side of a log before stacking. The underside bark was kept intact to block ground moisture rebound. Debarked surfaces faced the sky or sun, while barked surfaces faced downward or inward. This was not superstition, it was moisture vector control. The same logic applied to sunlight scheduling. Farmers preferred harvesting during low-sun winter weeks rather than late winter bright days, because high winter sun warmed the outer fibers too fast, causing micro cracks. Those cracks later became moisture entry points, during spring humidity peaks. Slower curing meant longer dryness retention. Finally, the entire harvest and storage pipeline included what modern science calls a humidity reset cadence. Every major seasonal shift triggered restacking and repositioning. Logs harvested in early winter were moved outward midwinter and inward by late winter once surface moisture was minimized. Stacks built before snowfall were rebuilt after the first snowmelt week to remove snow pressure sweat zones. Farmers even monitored wind dryness tones, a sensory system where wind that carried sea salt, fog smell, or thaw softness triggered immediate stack resets.